Hi everyone, welcome back. In the previous module, we introduced you to scope and how it works in the planes of user experience design. Now let's take it one step further and define scope in more detail. So what is scope anyway? Scope refers to the definition of combined objectives and requirements needed to complete a project. Properly defining the scope of a project allows for better estimates of costs and time required to deliver on the project. Scope is the definition of these combined objectives and requirements. So if we're thinking about functional specifications, content requirements, what we're doing is being as detailed as possible in how our project is going to work. We're taking the details that we learned in the strategy plane and we're turning them into a tangible definition of how it will actually work. We take what we want it to do and turn it into how we want to do it. Without properly defining scope of a project, your estimates become less accurate. You have larger ranges of costs and time, and it's a little bit more difficult to help share what will actually be done with clients, colleagues, and ultimately your end user. How we define scope is conditional on external factors. And what that really means is, what type of project are we launching? What's the time frame? What can we do within a limited time frame, for example, or within a limited budget? It behooves us to speak about scope in juxtaposition to time and budget. Let's speak a little bit about methodology when it comes to executing on scope. In this example, we're going to compare waterfall methodology to agile methodology. Waterfall is a method that allows us to take the time and define exact requirements and parameters, and then execute on those requirements until you have a finished product. That's the product that you hand off to your client and your users for testing. In an agile method, the scope is a little bit more segmented. There will be scope that gets us to a first release, a second release, a third release. Now, we're only going to cover waterfall and agile methodologies at a high level today, but I hope the next few slides illustrate a little bit more of what that means. Here's a great illustration to indicate the difference between performing a project from beginning to end without any previous releases versus one where we're layering in functionality and content throughout. The first line of this diagram shows how we would build a project from beginning to end by executing on the functionality and the content that's defined in the scope plane. Whereas the second line in this diagram illustrates how throughout the project there are micro releases of functionality. In this analogy, of course, we're building a car eventually, but the car we build can either be built in pieces and parts or built up through layering in methods of getting to that destination. It's less about the journey in the agile methodology than it is having something tangible to show your client and your users. It really depends if the first thing that's seen in the general public is in fact needs to be perfect, or can we introduce something that is a little less functional than the final perfect version needs to be? Let me introduce to you a term that we use in software development called minimum viable product, otherwise known as MVP. MVP is the least amount of functionality a project team can deliver in one release. So, in the first time that something is publicly provided, for the solution to be useful to the end customer. So, it has to do something, with, of course, the understanding that there will be future releases. Imagine you have a banking application that is supposed to allow you to check your balance, transfer funds, and deposit checks. In a waterfall methodology, all of those building blocks would be created and then the entire application would be released at once. Whereas in an agile method, the first feature would be released on its own, check your balance. And then in release 2, they would layer in the ability to transfer funds. And in release 3 would be the ability to deposit a check. All of those features of the product are useful to the user, but do they meet the business objectives that your client has set out? Sometimes it comes down to whether your client wants something that has more speed to market and the motivation to do that, or whether they really need something perfect to address multiple needs of their users. Agile development versus waterfall looks a little bit like this. Agile is circular. There's a design, development, test, and learn mentality to it. Whereas in waterfall, we carefully define requirements, design our solution, implement it, test it, and then it's live. And there's continued optimization throughout, but everything in the scope definition has been delivered. And there's pros and cons of each, which we can cover in another course. In each one of these methodologies, we have two different ways of capturing our requirements. In waterfall, which is what we're going to spend most time talking about, we call our definition of scope functional requirements. Whereas in an agile methodology, we call what we gather as scope definition user stories. Functional requirements are traditional requirements that describe how a software should act. The intent of the system is the main focus. Requirements documents go into great detail on how an area of software should work, and the detail is quite important when you're creating the entire solution at once without micro releases. In an agile methodology, we define scope a little more loosely. User stories are short descriptions of functionality told from a user's point of view. The focus is on why and how the user interacts with the software, and less about the exact requirements of how it functions. And the reason being is that there are many more times throughout the agile methodology that your software or product can be reviewed by your client to ensure accuracy. And that's the benefit of agile methodology is you can do it again, and it's a short 2 to 3 week timeline to release and improve that same product. Here's an example of a few requirements for a basic e-commerce site. Display the name of each item in the shopping cart. Display the quantity of each item in the shopping cart. Allow the user to remove any items from the shopping cart. And I can add a few more. Allow the user to increment or decrement items in the shopping cart. Allow the user to close the shopping cart. Display the subtotal and the estimated tax in the shopping cart. Allow the ability for the business to add a countdown timer to the shopping cart. I could go on forever because there are so many different requirements that you could put into something like a shopping cart. It really comes down to how much time do you have, what is your budget like, and what does your client want? Also, depending on the specific industry vertical you're in, your users may want different information in their shopping cart versus other industry verticals. Make sure you take all of these things into account when you're defining what the scope of your project is. User stories, on the other hand, take a more formulaic approach. Here's an example of one. As a persona, I want desired action, goes there, so that desired reason or outcome. So that formula in execution for a basic e-commerce site would say, as a customer, I want to be able to view the items in my cart so that I know for sure what I'm purchasing. And how you use functional specifications versus user stories aren't much different. In the design process, we refer to user stories in the same way as we would in functional specifications. We want to be sure that we are designing against those user stories and functional specifications. And at every checkpoint throughout our design process from this point on, we'll look back at how scope was defined to be sure that we're not over-delivering on scope or under-delivering on scope. Both have negative connotations to the relationship that we will have with our clients. Here's a website for Hopedale Dental Care. And on their homepage, they have a homepage carousel, which is that big banner image that you see in the middle of the page. I want you to pause the video and take a few moments to define the functional spec or the user stories for this homepage carousel. Now that you're back, I'll share that I've taken the time to define this functional specification myself, and you can see that in the next module. But before we go there, let's talk about why we define scope. Well, first and foremost, it's so the team knows what it is building. It helps set milestones, release dates, and phases for the evolution of your project. It also helps identify team members, roles, and work products. And it serves to illuminate the connections between individual requirements. First, let's talk about milestones and release dates. Without defining the scope of a project, how can we know how complex or simple it is? And once we do know how complex and simple it is, we'll be able to give a little bit more of visibility into the timeline of the project. As far as identifying team members' roles and work products, let me speak a little bit about that. If we know exactly what we need to do and what we need to do, we'll know exactly who we need to execute on that scope. For example, if we know that we need some complicated geolocation and indexing, we may need to bring in a specific developer with that skill set. Or if we're going to be doing complex animation in our interaction design, we may want to bring in a 3D animator. And then, of course, the connections between individual requirements. UX is better when there are consistent elements that do the same thing. And if you can link individual requirements and allow them to function in a similar way, your user experience will be much better. Another reason why we define scope is that the team knows what it's not building. Very often, features seem like great ideas, but may not be aligned with strategic objectives. And something that may be amazing and sound amazing in theory may be either too complicated or not as complicated as it should be when defining the solution for your client. It also means what you are not building right now. Whatever we don't define in scope is an indication of what we won't be doing within the project confines. And that's equally as important. If something is not in scope, and by definition it's not defined as in scope, then your client should understand that you won't be doing it. What you define to be in scope is exactly what you're going to do in the project, and anything left out is out. By defining the scope and understanding that everything that isn't defined is out of scope, we'll keep the project on track, on time, and on budget. Here's a little video that illustrates how cost, scope, and time are so codependent. Imagine your requirements are to draw a picture of Spider-Man. You can define the scope in many different ways, but ultimately it's defined as drawing a picture of Spider-Man. But if you don't define the level of detail, the amount of time that can be spent, and effectively how much you can spend on that illustrator, you might get a few different versions of that same illustration. So let's take a look at what happens when you give an illustrator 10 minutes, 1 minute, and 10 seconds to do the same scope. I hope you really enjoyed that. And that's setting us up to really talk about something that's extremely important to consider during the scope plan. That's the codependency of scope on cost and time. One of the main reasons that we describe scope as much as we possibly can is because it will greatly affect the amount of time that a project will take and how much money it will cost. And in the middle, we try to balance quality alongside defining scope, understanding cost, and following a timeline. More about that in another course. But make sure you consider this while you're defining scope. The other thing we really want to avoid during our definition of scope is scope creep. If we're too ambiguous in our definition of scope, then our client may make assumptions over what we're going to be doing for them. So the more definition we can get, the better. Scope creep is the piling up of small changes that by themselves are manageable, but in aggregate are fairly significant. And I'm sure you've probably lived some of this previously. Getting a phone call later on in the project saying, hey, could you just add another page into this information architecture? Oh, I forgot. There needs to be a module that captures the user's email. Could you just slide that into the bottom of the wireframes? Oh, we forgot the button to ask for donations. Can you just get that into the top right of the mocks? Every little change that's outside of scope and outside of agreed upon parameters will cost time and money. Scope creep can be extremely detrimental to both the budget and timeline of a project, as well as the relationship management of that project's stakeholders. You need to be stern in your ability to say no, but also understand that you need to work with these people on a regular basis. So balancing those expectations while controlling scope is a really tough dance. To wrap up, in this module, we talked about scope, the different influences on scope, and all of the reasons why defining scope is so important. We'll see you in the next module.